Hello there, everybody, and welcome to another TCG meta-analysis. Anthony joining you once again, and we are now a couple of weeks removed from the end of Encounter 2, the Even Waves Only event, and while the next event in the Encounter series, Encounter 3, is going to be all standard waves 1 through 8, there are some things that happened in Encounter 2 that might have some ramifications going forward. But before we get started with the discussion of that, I do want to mention that for the end of the year highlight reel, I am letting you pick the highlights. Down in the description, I have a link to a Google form that you can fill out with the link of a video, a timestamp, and basically a name suggestion. Basically, you get to submit what you think were the best moments of the year. I ask that you only submit one highlight per submission, but you can submit the form multiple times, so if you have multiple things you want to be put into consideration, you can just do that multiple times. At some point in the late part of December, I will be going through all of that and compiling the highlight reel. So be sure to go do that. You have about 2 months to do that. But in the meanwhile, let's start talking about Encounter 2. And let's start off by talking about a trend that I started talking about back in E1, but this has now been solidified despite the format change. Wide teams are the way going forward for the most part. I already discussed this back in the E1 video, like I said, but in Encounter 2, 7 of the 12 decks were 4 wide or larger in the main board, and back in Encounter 1, that number was 10 out of 16. Across both events, that puts the number of wide teams overall to about 61%, and the number of wide decks in the top cut was 11 of 16, or 68%. There's not too much of a difference between those numbers, and it's overall not too high. But what it does signify is that you're going to be playing against more wide teams than not, and you're going to want to be prepared for it in the main deck. Now, there has been some talk as to whether tall teams can compete in the first place or not, especially when both Encounter 1 and 2 were won by Stephen Moss, playing basically the same team, minus some E2 adjustments to make it more gainer-centric. But there definitely is room for tall teams in the meta. Naga got 3rd in Encounter 1 with a 2-wide deck in Ultra Jet, as well as 3rd in Encounter 2 with a 3-wide in Galaxy Prime, despite me and Legendary saying that wasn't good. Meanwhile, Vangelis got 4th in Encounter 1 with Opportune Amalgamation, and Ozzy got 2nd in Encounter 2 with Treadfire. However, all these decks have one thing in common. They all have high defensive capabilities. Ultra Jet, Galaxy Prime, and Treadfire are all blue decks, and Opportune Amalgamation features a boatload of repair shenanigans, as well as the ever-annoying Exhaust Brutal Conditioning combo to deal with big swings. Looking past these, every other 3-wide or taller team, aside from Fort Max getting 5th in Encounter 1, was near the bottom of the standings. Admittedly, this might be a result of the characters being played rather than it being a case of defense versus offense, as there were blue decks in this lot that centered around Sunstorm in Encounter 1, and either Roadmaster, Crosshairs, or Galaxy Prime in E2, but the trend does seem to be aiming towards more blue-centric tall teams being the way to go if you want to play tall. Again, not to say you can't play an orange tall build, but you need to find ways to tank hits like Opportune Amalgamation did if you're thinking about going that route. Going back to talking about wide teams, there's a couple of other repercussions of this shift. First is the fact that direct damage is more important now than ever. Now, there didn't seem to be nearly as much direct damage in Encounter 2 compared to normal, though that may have just been a symptom of Cayman being banned, and going into Encounter 3, I'm expecting the numbers to rebound, but regardless, you need to be playing direct damage in this format, otherwise it's going to be very difficult to deal with wider teams, since a lot of them seem to have the annoying tendency to stop just enough damage to leave them alive on 1 or 2, and with the way health has been distributed on these teams, wasting a full attack on a low health target is a waste of time. I know this is basic information when it comes to playing this game competitively, but it's worth reiterating because of this format specifically in case anyone's jumping in for the first time in E3, and to remind everybody that you forgot to put 3 Cayman in your deck. I know, I'm guilty of that. Anyways, the other shift, combiners. They haven't been doing too much this season thus far, with one exception we'll touch on in a minute, but there's enough potential with a few of them due to the innately wide meta that they're worth a consideration. Of course, Devastator's still a lingering threat with the gain knowledge that I discussed in the post-Encounter 1 video, where replacing the wheel turn enablers with single target boosts might be the way in this meta. However, Menasor and Superion might also be considerations. The latter is a bit of a risk with Magray floating around, sorry Frank, but with the rise of Gators as of late, I'm not sure that would be floating around nearly as much, and Superion has always been historically a good combiner, so it's worth a consideration, especially with it having an extra blocker and power glide from Wave 6. As for Menasor, As Season 2 started up, Ozzy and Wheeljank were doing some alpha testing with some other nonsense with Menasor, just because, and realized that the suite of actions available nowadays has indirectly boosted Menasor's power. And with a limited action pool, Menasor did manage to make top 8 in Encounter 2, so the potential is there for Menasor to make a good run in E3 with everything available. Now, I did mention there is a lone exception to Combiners not doing too much, and that would be Abominus. He got 7th and 8th in Encounter 1 and 4th in Encounter 2, and when you look at how the decks were built, it's easy to see why. A combination of an orange shell, powerful early game control tools, and one of the most powerful combiner modes in the game has him in a position in the meta that I'd honestly equate to where Devastator was in the OI. But there's one more thing with Abominus that actually has me worried that combiners aside from him may not do too much. The combine mode trigger that flips everyone. This absolutely screws over combiners and is part of the reason that Abominus actually beat Superion in E2's top 8, and even Nucleon exposure doesn't do too much to stop it because it causes all your guys except any one you flip off of its effect to take 2 damage. Now, Menasor is a bit more favored against this, as if you flip a Nucleon, Motormaster can prevent most of the damage, but all other combiners might have a bit more of a rough time against Abominus, especially if Abominus goes first. So if you're looking at a combiner, be sure you have that in mind. Okay, so those are the big pickups I noticed from E2, but let's talk about some other cards that might start popping up more. On the battle card front, there's 2 cards in particular I'm looking closely at. First, and this relates to the direct damage point, we're at the point where you need to be main decking Tripwire. Odds are there's going to be a 5-star character that your opponent's going to try and turtle with. I'm looking directly at Crasher here. So having this on hand to put a quick stop to that is going to be key for the foreseeable future. While we're on the subject of previously niche sideboard cards, Soldier's Blaster. Gators have been starting to pop up in large numbers as of late. You can thank Bullag and Lasagna Sauce for that. So having this on hand, even if it's just in the side, isn't nearly as risky of a play as it once was. As for stuff on the deck front, there's 2 other decks I could see doing stuff based on what happened in E2. First up, and I swear I'm not patting myself on the back here, is Gyric ASP. Now, I tried running this in Encounter 3 last season, but it flopped horribly. However, with the wider meta, meaning that more characters are affected by Gyric's -1 health, there's some potential there, but there are 2 cards in particular that are also helping to propel this just a bit more. Masher Mace and Shanix Laundering. The former's been around for a while, I can speak, and people just didn't see its value as a more consistent flamethrower. You can thank Lasagna Sauce for that. But the latter was a Wave 8 release, and it's competing for the title of Best Orange Draw card alongside Scrounging for Energon. Plus the fact it's a green and it's an easy 3 of an ASP. To add to all that, this deck did make it to top 8 in E2 with only 2 ASP members, Tailwind and Nightflight, so adding Stormcloud back in for E3 should give it a bit more juice in terms of making Tailwind a late game threat. As for the other deck, we have Gators. Now, all of the Gators are independently powerful. Ayuk is a fantastic attacker and recovery tool in a blue deck. Oronic is a Pierce Negator and is basically a better Ransack in a blue deck. And Bullag makes playing weapons a living nightmare. We saw both Steven and Legendary slap all 3 Gators into a deck, and it proved successful. But even slapping 2 Gators into a list alongside something like Galaxy Prime, looking at you, Naga, was a viable move. Or is a viable move, I should say. And given that E2's winning list was essentially Gators plus good stuff, while E1's was also basically good stuff, I wouldn't be surprised if Gators start showing up more as a strategy going forward. And while we're on the subject of Quintesson archetypes, I do want to quickly highlight Sharks, even though they didn't do anything in E2, since not only do they benefit from Shanix Laundering heavily, but their revival shenanigans allow for some flexing of the wheel turn that can compete in power with cars, plus Ripper Snapper offers the deck an extra attacker. However, the deck is extremely difficult to pilot, so it's a toss-up as to whether we see this going forward or not. And then one more thing, some people were saying that Roadmaster has some potential, but I completely disagree. Call this a hot take all you want, but the main advantage that was being suggested was that you could go 7 wide with that team before you combine. And while that technically is true, it's fairly easy to play around, and with people being guaranteed to be packing Cayman once again, you're probably never going to have more than 1 drone out at a time, and 4 wide with one of those characters being 2 health is not exactly optimal. So that's really everything that I'm kind of getting from E2 and what we could potentially see going forward into Encounter 3. Of course, that'll be a little while out because we got a losers event running right now. But it should be fun to see what happens. And if you do want to watch all this action live, whether it's E3 or losers, there is a link in the description to the Twitch channel where you can watch that live, as well as the archive channel where you can catch things after the fact. But for now, hopefully you enjoyed what you saw here today, or heard today, I guess. If you did enjoy this, there is a little red button. You can push it down below to show that. And next week, I'm not sure what the video is going to be, but 2 weeks from now is going to be the Omega Supreme Files anniversary video again. So looking forward to recording that. But for now, that will do it for this video. Peace out, y'all.